Out in the deepest, quietest part of space, so far out that even the stars seemed tired and dim, a broken ship floated without direction. It wasn't shiny or fast. It looked more like a ghost than a vessel, rusted in places, patched with old metal plates trailing thin ribbons of frozen vapor from its failing life support systems. Inside, a small group of beings moved slowly, carefully, like people trying not to wake a sleeping storm. They were the last of their kind. They came from a world covered in oceans, deep, warm, glowing seas where their cities grew like living coral, breathing with the tides. They never built weapons. They never conquered. Their greatest skill was healing, repairing damaged ecosystems, helping life bloom where it had faded. But that very gift made others afraid. To the powerful civilizations that ruled the galaxy, kindness without control was a threat. So they were labeled dangerous, unstable, a risk to the order of things. And just like that, they were cut off, left behind, forgotten. Now, centuries later, their ship, their last home, was dying. Power flickered. Food ran low. Many had already passed, wrapped in woven seaweed shrouds and released into the void. Only a few hundred remained, most of them elders or very young. They spent their days in near silence, tending to the few working systems, sharing stories of the ocean moon they'd never seen, and singing soft, watery songs that echoed through the damp corridors like whale calls in a deep trench. They weren't singing for rescue. They'd given up on that long ago. They sang to remember who they were, to keep their spirit alive a little longer. Back on Earth, life moved fast. People rushed through their days, checking phones, chasing deadlines, arguing online, trying to get by. Most never looked up at the night sky unless a plane passed overhead or a bright meteor streaked across the clouds. But in a small, wind-battered research station on the edge of the Pacific, one person did look up. And more importantly, she listened. She wasn't famous. She didn't wear a lab coat with fancy badges. She was just someone who'd always been drawn to the quiet voices of the world. The hum of plankton under a microscope, the clicks of dolphins in the dark, the slow pulse of deep-sea vents. She'd spent years studying life that most people never saw, learning that even the tiniest creature had a story to tell if you paid attention. That's why, when a strange signal popped up in the deep space monitoring feed, she didn't ignore it like everyone else. At first, it sounded like noise, just static buried under layers of cosmic interference. But something about it felt off, not random, like a heartbeat hidden in a storm. Late one night, with rain tapping against the windows and the station nearly empty, she pulled up the data again. She slowed it down, filtered out the usual space noise. And then she heard it, a pattern, a rhythm that rose and fell like breath. It repeated, not perfectly, but with intention, like someone tapping on a wall in the dark, hoping someone would tap back. Her hands trembled as she ran the analysis. No known natural source, no exploding star, no spinning neutron star, no satellite glitch could explain this. It had structure, emotion, maybe even language. She showed it to her team the next morning, but most just shrugged. Probably a data echo, one said. Or interference from that new satellite cluster. Another guessed. They had budgets to meet, reports to file. Chasing whispers from deep space wasn't on the agenda, but she couldn't shake it. She kept thinking about her own family. How her grandparents had fled their home during a war, carrying only a small bundle and a song their mother used to sing. How they'd sent letters into the unknown, not knowing if anyone would ever read them. That memory stuck with her. This signal, it felt the same. Not a threat. A message. A hand reaching out from the dark. So she worked quietly late into the night using spare computing time, writing emails to old contacts, pulling favors. She recorded a short, honest video. Not flashy, just her in a plain room explaining why this mattered. Not because it might be aliens, but because it might be someone lost. Someone hoping to be found. Slowly, a few people started to listen, not because they believed in little green men, but because they trusted her. They knew she wasn't the type to chase fantasies. If she said something was off, it probably was. After weeks of pushing, a small window opened. An old deep space probe, technically retired but still functional, could be reprogrammed to point toward the signal's origin. It wouldn't give high-res images, but it could confirm if something was really out there. The data would take months to come back. But it was a chance. While Earth debated, the Kalari ship drifted closer. Their last working sensor picked up a new signal, not a reply, but a focused beam from a small blue planet. Someone was looking, really looking. On the Ark, the elders gathered in the central chamber where soft bioluminescent algae still glowed on the walls. They argued in hushed tones. Should they respond? What if it was a trap? They'd been betrayed before, but silence meant death. In the end, they chose to answer, not with force but with truth. They activated their final beacon, sending out a gentle harmonic tone woven from their oldest lullaby. It carried their location, their biology, their history of peace, and their quiet plea. We are here. We mean no harm. Please, don't look away. Back on Earth, the scientist sat alone in the dim glow of her monitor as the first images from the probe began to load. At first, it was just blurry shapes like looking through fogged glass. Then it cleared. A ship. Huge. Ancient. Shaped like a seashell, covered in strange growths that looked almost organic. And then the life signs, faint but steady, breathing, waiting. She didn't jump up. She didn't call the news. She just sat there, tears rolling down her cheeks. One hand pressed against her chest like she was holding her heart in place. Because in that moment she didn't see monsters or invaders. She saw people, beings, who had been cast out, left to die just for being different. She saw her grandparents. She saw every refugee, every outcast, every soul told they didn't belong. Outside, the world kept rushing. Cars honked, phones buzzed, headlines screamed. But inside that quiet room, something changed. A thread of connection had stretched across light years, not through weapons or power, but through one person choosing to listen. And out in the cold dark, the Kailari felt it too. For the first time in generations, they weren't just drifting. They were seen. And that tiny spark of being noticed, that was enough to keep their hope alive a little longer. The world didn't believe it at first. Not really. When the images from the deep space probe finally arrived, grainy, shadowy, but undeniably real, most people thought it was a hoax. A glitch, a clever bit of CGI cooked up for clicks. But as more data poured in, the truth became harder to ignore. There was a ship, not human, not from anywhere in our solar system, and it was heading straight for Earth. Panic spread faster than facts. News channels lit up with dramatic music and bold red headlines. Alien vessel enters orbit. Are we under attack? Social media exploded with wild theories. Some said it was a divine sign. Others claimed it was a secret government project gone wrong. A few even insisted it was just space junk-shaped funny. But deep down in quiet homes and late-night conversations, a different question began to form. What if they're not here to hurt us? Governments scrambled. Emergency meetings were held behind closed doors. Military satellites tracked the ship's slow, steady approach. But something strange stood out. It wasn't acting like a warship. No weapons charged, no aggressive maneuvers. It just drifted, like a leaf on a river, its path curving gently toward the Pacific Ocean. As if it knew Earth's waters might be its only chance. Meanwhile, the scientist who'd first heard the signal stood in a crowded briefing room, trying to be heard over the noise of generals and politicians. She didn't shout. She didn't wave her arms. She just held up a recording, the soft, mournful song the ship had sent back. Listen, she said. This isn't a threat. It's a surrender. Some rolled their eyes. Others stayed quiet. But a few leaned in. Because the sound, it didn't feel alien. It felt lonely. As the ship entered low orbit, its outer hull began to glow faintly, not from heat, but from something inside. Bioluminescence. Like deep-sea creatures lighting up the ocean dark. It slowed even more, then released a series of gentle pulses. Not radio waves, but low-frequency vibrations that traveled through the upper atmosphere and rippled across the ocean surface. Marine researchers picked it up instantly. Whales changed their songs. Dolphins gathered in unusual numbers. Even plankton reacted. Whatever this was, it spoke the language of water. That's when the decision was made, not by a president or a general, but by a small international team of scientists, oceanographers, and humanitarian advisors. They would meet the visitors, not with guns but with an open hand. A research vessel, retrofitted with extra life support systems and translation software, was sent to a remote patch of the South Pacific, far from shipping lanes and prying eyes. The night they arrived, the sea was calm. Moonlight silvered the waves. Everyone on deck held their breath. Then slowly the alien ship descended, not crashing, not landing, but settling, like a whale surfacing to breathe. A section of its hull opened and figures emerged. Tall, slender, with smooth, translucent skin that shimmered like wet pearl. Their eyes were large, dark, and full of something hard to name. Exhaustion, yes, but also a quiet dignity. One of them stepped forward, barefoot on the wet deck, water dripping from their limbs. They didn't speak. Instead, they raised a webbed hand, palm open, fingers slightly spread. A universal gesture. I come in peace. The scientist stepped forward too, heart pounding. She mirrored the gesture. Then slowly she played back the lullaby, the one they'd sent from deep space. The moment the first notes filled the air, the alien's shoulders relaxed. A soft light pulsed along their arms, gentle as a heartbeat. They made a sound, low, melodic, like water swirling in a shell. Not words, but understanding. Over the next few hours, they communicated through gestures, drawings in the condensation on windows, and shared sounds. The aliens, now known as the Kailari, showed images on a smooth, living screen grown from their own biotech, their ocean moon, their cities, their exile. They pointed to Earth's oceans, then to themselves, then placed a hand over their chest. We need water. We need to live. They weren't asking for much. Just a chance. Back on land, the world watched. Not through secret feeds, but through carefully released footage. Grainy, real, human. No dramatic music. Just two beings from opposite ends of existence, trying to understand each other under the same moon. And something shifted. People started leaving things on beaches. Bundles of kelp, clean seawater in glass jars, handmade drawings of oceans and stars. Fishermen radioed in sightings of strange lights beneath the waves, not with fear but wonder. School kids wrote letters they knew would never be read, just to say, "You're not alone." Of course, not everyone was kind. Conspiracy theorists claimed it was a trap. Some governments demanded the Kailari be contained, studied, controlled. But the images of that first meeting, the open hands, the shared song, had already taken root in people's hearts. It was hard to fear someone who looked so tired, so gentle, so much like us in their need to belong. The scientist stayed with them through those first days, sleeping in shifts, learning their rhythms. She noticed how they touched the ocean like it was family, how they flinched at loud noises but calmed at the sound of rain, how they cried, not with tears but with soft pulses of light, when they saw Earth's coral reefs, even the dying ones. They saw beauty where others saw loss. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the lead Kailari, older, with scars along their arms, placed a small, glowing orb in the scientist's hand. It warmed to her touch, and inside tiny patterns swirled like living constellations. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew it was a gift, a thank you, a beginning. That night, as the research ship rocked gently on the waves, the Kailari sang again. Not the sad song from deep space, but something new, lighter, hopeful. And for the first time, a human voice joined in, softly, imperfectly, trying to match the melody. No one knew what came next. Would the world accept them? Could they survive here? But in that moment, under a sky full of stars they both came from, two lost kinds of beings found something rare. Trust. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. After that first quiet meeting on the ocean, the world held its breath. What would happen next? Would fear win or something softer? In the end, it was decided the Kailari would be given a place to stay. Not in a lab, not behind glass, but in a protected stretch of cold, clean ocean off the southern coast of Chile. The site had once been a marine research station, abandoned after funding dried up. Now it became something new, a home. Workers arrived first, engineers, biologists, divers, not with weapons, but with tools. They rebuilt docks, installed gentle filtration systems, and planted native seaweed beds. Everything was done slowly, carefully, like you'd approach a wild animal that might run if startled. The Kailari watched from a distance, their ship anchored just offshore, its soft glow lighting the waves at night like a second moon. When they finally moved in, it wasn't with fanfare. No speeches, no cameras crowding in, just a quiet transfer from their ancient ark to the new sanctuary. Rooms carved into the cliffside, flooded with seawater, warmed by geothermal vents, open to the sky above. They didn't need beds or chairs. They needed flow, currents, clean salt water, and space to breathe. At first, people kept their distance. Scientists observed from behind one-way glass, taking notes, measuring oxygen levels, tracking bioluminescent patterns. But the Kalari weren't specimens. They were neighbors. And slowly, quietly, they began to show what they could do. One morning, a team of marine biologists arrived to check on a dying patch of coral nearby. To their shock, it was already healing, new polyps blooming, color returning where there had been only gray. They followed the trail of change and found a Kalari elder sitting nearby, hands resting on the reef, fingertips glowing faintly. The being looked up, not startled, just calm, and made a soft clicking sound like stones tapping underwater. It wasn't magic. It was biology. Their touch released enzymes, microbes, signals that told the coral, "You can live again." Word spread, not through press releases but through fishermen, divers, local kids who snorkeled near the sanctuary. They'd come back with stories. How the water was clearer, how fish returned in numbers no one had seen in years, how even the kelp forests seemed to grow faster, greener. Some called it a miracle. Others called it science. Either way, it was real, but not everyone welcomed it. Rumors started. "They're changing our oceans," some said. "What if their biology spreads? What if it's dangerous?" Fear always finds a voice, especially when things are new. Online angry posts claimed the Kalari were secretly taking over, that their healing was a trick. A few politicians demanded they be moved to a sealed facility, for safety. Yet for every voice of fear, another rose in kindness. A local fisherman began leaving bundles of fresh kelp at the sanctuary's edge each morning. A school teacher brought her students to draw pictures of sea creatures and tape them to the observation windows. Teenagers recorded whale songs and played them near the water, hoping the Kalari would respond. It wasn't grand. It was human. Small acts of welcome, offered without expecting anything back. The scientist who'd first heard their signal became their bridge. Not their leader, not their guard, just someone who listened, who translated not just words but feelings. She learned that the Kalari didn't speak in sentences the way humans did. Their language was layered: sound, light, touch, even scent. A single phrase could carry history, emotion, and a question all at once. She spent hours sitting with them on the rocks at dusk, sharing silence more than speech. And in those quiet moments, she learned their truth. They hadn't been exiled for being dangerous. They'd been cast out for refusing to weaponize their gift. Their crime was compassion. One day, during a storm, a young Kalari got caught in a strong current and washed too far from the sanctuary. A local teenager, out checking his family's fishing nets, saw the flash of bioluminescence in the churning waves. Without thinking, he dove in, fighting the cold and the pull of the sea, and helped guide the being back to safety. When he returned home, shivering and soaked, his parents didn't scold him. They made him soup, wrapped him in blankets, and said, "You did the right thing." That small act, human helping alien, without hesitation, made headlines not for drama, but for hope. People began to see the Kalari not as visitors from another world, but as people who'd lost theirs. Refugees, just like so many on Earth. And that changed everything. Inside the sanctuary, trust grew. The Kalari started sharing more. Songs that mapped ancient ocean currents, patterns that predicted algal blooms, even ways to clean oil from water using living filters grown from their own cells. They didn't hoard knowledge. They offered it freely, like seeds tossed into fertile soil. And humans in turn shared too. They played music, cello, drums, even old folk songs by the water's edge. The Kalari would gather, their skin pulsing in time with the rhythm. They tasted earth fruits and made funny faces at lemons. They watched children laugh on the beach and mimicked their joy with soft chiming sounds. It wasn't perfect. Misunderstandings happened. Fears flared. But every time someone chose patience over panic, someone chose to reach out instead of pull away. One evening, as the sun set in streaks of orange and purple, the lead Kalari elder stood at the water's edge with the scientist. They placed a hand on the wet rock between them, and a soft blue light spread from their palm, tracing the shape of a spiral, like a galaxy, like a shell, like a heartbeat. The scientist placed her hand over it. Warmth passed between them. No words needed. In that moment, it was clear, this wasn't just about saving the Kalari. It was about saving something in humanity too, the part that still believes in kindness even when it's hard. The part that listens before it judges. The part that offers kelp on a quiet morning just because. And in the waters below, life bloomed, brighter, stronger, fuller, because two kinds of beings chose to heal together. Peace never lasts long when the universe is watching. Just as the Kalari began to settle into their new home, just as children waved at them from the shore and scientists shared data like old friends, a new signal arrived from deep space. Not a song this time, not a plea, a warning. It came in the form of 3 sleek silver vessels that dropped out of warp far beyond the moon. They didn't broadcast. They didn't ask permission. They simply appeared like shadows sliding into a sunlit room. Within hours, every major government on Earth received the same message, delivered in perfect cold translation. The Kalari are under galactic quarantine. Return them immediately. Failure to comply will be seen as an act of defiance against the Interstellar Accord. No one knew who sent it. No one had ever seen ships like this. But the tone was clear. This wasn't a request. It was a threat wrapped in law. Panic returned sharper this time. News channels replayed old footage of the Kalari's arrival, now edited with ominous music. Are we risking war for strangers? One anchor asked. Military bases went on high alert. Emergency meetings ran through the night. Some leaders argued that Earth had no choice. Hand them over, avoid conflict, protect our own. After all, we barely knew these beings. What if they really were dangerous? What if their healing was just the first step of something worse? The scientist who'd stood with them from the beginning sat in a tense room filled with generals, diplomats, and scientists. She watched as maps were spread out, evacuation plans drawn, containment protocols reviewed. No one talked about the Kalari as people anymore. They were a situation, a liability, a risk factor. But she remembered the night the young Kalari got lost in the storm. She remembered the fisherman's son pulling them from the waves without a second thought. She remembered the coral coming back to life, the way the elders' eyes softened when children left drawings on the glass. This wasn't about risk. It was about responsibility. She stood up. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough to be heard. They came to us broken, she said. We gave them shelter. That means something. If we give them up now, just because someone from the stars says so, what does that say about us? Silence followed. Not agreement, but pause. And in that pause, something shifted. Meanwhile, the Kalari sensed the change. They felt the tension in the water, the sudden absence of visitors, the way the guards now stood farther back, hands near their belts. They didn't panic. They gathered in their sanctuary singing low, mournful songs, not for themselves, but for Earth. They knew what was coming. They'd been betrayed before. But this time, Earth didn't turn away. Ordinary people began to speak up. Fishermen held a silent vigil on their boats, lights glowing on the dark water. Students organized peaceful marches with signs that read, "Sanctuary is sacred," and "We chose kindness. Don't take it back." Scientists from dozens of countries signed an open letter. The Kalari's biotechnology wasn't a weapon. It was a lifeline. Their methods had already reversed acidification in local reefs, cleaned microplastics from seawater, and revived kelp forests thought lost forever. This wasn't danger. It was hope. Then came the breakthrough. Deep in the archives of the Kalari's ship, the scientist found something they'd never shared before, a full record of their exile. Not just words, but living data, genetic logs, star charts, recordings of the trial that banished them. And the truth was worse than anyone imagined. The Kalari hadn't been exiled for being unstable. They'd been cast out because they refused to help weaponize their life-giving science. When powerful empires asked them to design organisms that could drain oceans or poison atmospheres, they said no, and for that they were labeled a threat and abandoned. The scientist compiled the evidence, clear, undeniable, heartbreaking. She didn't leak it to the press. She presented it directly to the United Nations, in a session broadcast live to the world. No jargon, no theatrics. Just facts, images, and one simple question. If we send them back, are we any better than those who abandoned them? The room fell silent. Then one by one, nations began to speak, not as rivals, but as neighbors. A small island nation that had lost its reefs spoke first. They gave us back our sea. We will not give them up. A country once torn by war said, "We know what it means to be cast out. We stand with them." Even nations that had been skeptical began to shift. In the end, the vote wasn't close. Earth chose unity, chose memory, chose mercy. The message sent back to the silver ships was short. The Kalari are under Earth's protection. They are not leaving. We invite dialogue, but not demands. The alien vessels hovered for 3 days, silent, watching. Then, without a word, they turned and vanished into the stars. No one celebrated with fireworks. There was no victory parade. But that night, people gathered along coastlines around the world, not to protest, not to fear, but to stand together. Candles floated on the water. Songs rose into the air, human songs, whale songs, and faintly from the sanctuary, the Kalari's own gentle harmonies. Inside the research station, the lead Kalari elder placed a hand on the glass, watching the lights on the shore. Their skin pulsed softly, blue, then gold, then green, the colors of gratitude, of relief, of home. The scientist stood beside them, quiet. No words were needed. They both knew. Earth had just done something rare, not because it was easy, but because it was right. And somewhere out there, in the vast dark between stars, the message had been sent, not just to the silver ships, but to anyone listening. On this small blue world, compassion is not weakness. It is our strength. Years passed. The fear that once clung to the edges of the story faded, replaced by something quieter, deeper. Routine, trust, shared life. The Kalari didn't just survive on Earth. They began to belong. Their sanctuary off the Chilean coast grew into something more than a refuge. It became a living bridge between worlds. New generations were born there. Kalari children who'd never known the cold silence of deep space. Only the rhythm of Earth's tides, the taste of clean seawater, and the sound of human voices calling from the shore. They played among dolphins, their small bodies glowing like fireflies in the deep, chasing schools of fish through kelp forests that had once been dying but now thrived under their gentle care. People no longer gawked or whispered when they saw them. Locals waved from fishing boats. Tourists came not to stare, but to learn. Guided by both human and Kalari educators who taught how to listen to the ocean, how to read the health of a reef not with machines, but with patience and presence. Schools nearby added ocean stewardship to their curriculum, inspired by the way the Kalari treated every drop of water like a relative, and the healing didn't stop at the coast. With careful collaboration, Kalari biotechnology, never forced, never rushed, was shared in ways that respected both their ethics and Earth's ecosystems. In places where coral had bleached white and silent, tiny living patches grown from Kalari cultures were placed like seeds. Within months, color returned. Fish came back. Life stirred again. In polluted bays, they introduced gentle microbial filters that broke down toxins without harming other life. It wasn't magic. It was partnership. But the real change wasn't just in the water, it was in people. After the standoff with the silver ships, something shifted in how humanity saw itself. If Earth could stand up for the lost and the different, maybe it could do more. Inspired by the Kalari story, nations began revising old laws about refugees, not just human ones, but how we treat any life in need. Scientists started talking less about control and more about coexistence. Even kids, drawing pictures in classrooms, began sketching not just rockets and aliens, but hands reaching across oceans, stars, and species. The scientist who'd first heard the signal never became famous. She didn't want to be. She stayed close to the sanctuary, not as a leader, but as a friend. She spent her days walking the tide line with the Kalari elder, now bent with age but still sharp-eyed, still singing. They didn't need translation devices anymore. They understood each other in glances, in shared silences, in the way they both paused when a whale passed offshore. One evening, as the sun melted into the sea, they stood together on the rocks. Below them, Kalari children darted through the waves with local kids who'd grown up seeing them as neighbors, not strangers. Laughter mixed with the sound of water and the soft chiming calls of the young ones. The elder turned to the scientist and placed a small, smooth object in her palm. A spiral-shaped shell, grown from living material, warm to the touch. Inside it pulsed a soft, steady light like a heartbeat. It was a gift. Not just for her, but for Earth. Later that week, In a quiet ceremony with no cameras, no speeches, just a circle of humans and Kailari on the beach, they signed something new. The Accord of Shared Currents. It wasn't a treaty of power or trade. It was a promise that Earth would remain a place of refuge for any life cast out, lost, or seeking peace. A promise that listening would always come before fear. News of the Accord spread quietly, carried not by headlines but by word of mouth, by sailors, by scientists, by children writing to pen pals in other countries. And far beyond Earth, in corners of the galaxy where others suffered in silence, word began to travel. There's a blue world that hears. Back home, life went on, but softer now. People looked up at the stars not with dread, but curiosity. They walked beaches not just for vacation, but to feel connected. They planted trees, cleaned rivers, protected reefs, not because they had to, but because they'd learned that everything is tied together, like currents in a single ocean. One morning, the scientist walked down to the cove before sunrise. Mist hung over the water. She sat on a familiar rock and waited. Soon a young Kailari, barely older than a human teenager, emerged from the waves, glowing faintly in the gray light. They sat beside her without a word, watching the horizon. After a while, the young one hummed a tune, part Kailari lullaby, part something new, something earthborn. The scientist smiled. She didn't join in. She just listened, because that's what it all came down to in the end. Not grand battles or flashy technology, just the courage to hear someone's song when they're too tired to shout. The choice to offer shelter when the world says to shut the door. The quiet understanding that saving others sometimes saves us too. And as the first rays of sun touched the water, turning it gold, the two of them sat together, different, yet not so far apart, watching a new day begin, not as rescuer and rescued, but as friends who'd found each other in the dark and decided to stay.